Welcome, everyone. The Center of Excellence in Smart Construction is pleased to present this virtual seminar, Carbon Accounting in Construction, Scale Landscape, and Capacity Building. My name is Wendell Huda, and I'm the manager at the Center of Excellence in Smart Construction. Please note, we're recording this webinar and all lines are muted. If you need help at any time, please send us a message via the Q&A chat box. Today's event will last up to 60 minutes. We encourage you to ask questions throughout the event. Simply type them into the Q&A chat box in the lower center of the screen, and then be sure to click the send button. We would like to acknowledge our 5 industry partners who have been integral to the development of the center and their engagement with industry. We would also like to acknowledge our ongoing relationships with our affiliates and strategic alliances. It's now my pleasure to introduce our esteemed industry and academic experts. Dave Knight, a sustainability advisor at CESC, is the founding director at One Planet and has spent over 23 years working internationally across multiple industry and for various UN agencies to advance sustainable and ethical business practices. Within the construction sector, he has developed sustainability strategies and narratives, toolkits, and social valuation approaches for responsible sourcing, as well as audit and verification schemes. Dave is sustainability and board advisor to CESC, the constructional steel certification body, helping to develop its sustainable construction steel certification scheme, train auditors in sustainability, and supports sustainability aspects of its strategy. He represents CESC in the development of broader construction and steel sustainability initiatives. He's a lead auditor for the Aluminium Stewardship Initiative and for Responsible Steel, and has provided advice, training, and assurance to the steel and construction sectors for over 10 years. Ivano Anelli is a senior advisor of sustainability at Emirates Global Aluminium. He's widely acknowledged as the GCC's foremost expert in the fields of sustainability and carbon emission management. He's board director of the ESG Foundation, formerly CEO of Dubai Carbon, and the United Nations senior official before then. He's a subject matter expert in environmental economics and low carbon strategies. Ivano has extensive experience in facilitating economically relevant low carbon pathways. For the past 2 decades, he has aggregated and managed GHG national inventories across the GCC, NDCs, and state action plans with a focus on private sector synergies. He's part of the UAE negotiation team on carbon markets at the UNFCCC COP, as well as part of the ICAO working group on new market-based measure for aviation. Currently supports the UAE's input into CORSIA. Ivano is also working with the World Bank's Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition Partnership for Market Readiness and the newly launched Task Force for Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets. Fernando de los Rios is CEO and co-founder at Hyperion Robotics. Fernando has been building startups to disrupt the construction industry for the last 7 years. As co-founder and CEO of Hyperion Robotics, he leads the company's mission to accelerate the transition to an automated and sustainable construction industry. Ferenc Kiss, Renewable Energy, Sustainability, and Environmental Manager at Alpine Limited. He holds environmental management and renewable energy engineering degree and has a verifiable history of success in complex sustainability and renewable energy projects. Over the last 2 decades, he demonstrated a high level of expertise in scaling climate change solutions and developing globally significant projects across Europe, Southeast Asia, and recently in the Middle East. For the first 7 years of his career, Ferenc has been engaged as a very driven international advisor for international environmental organizations such as WWF, supporting the EU accession of Eastern European countries and harmonizing environmental and biodiversity regulations. After that, he was active for 3 years as a government environmental advisor in Central Mindanao, the Philippines. For the following 10 years, he's been involved with complex carbon and energy management initiatives within the aviation business as head of the environment at Budapest Airport. At present, he found reward and satisfaction in working with multidisciplinary teams committed to developing sustainable city and clean energy projects, innovative solutions, and sustainable building services. Hala Youssef is Sustainability Director, Project and Development Services, Middle East and Africa at JLL. She's a sustainability engineer with over 15 years of experience in design, building services, facilities management, and government policy across the UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Australia, New Zealand, and Singapore. A mechatronics and environmental engineer by trade, Hala focuses on delivering innovative sustainability and environmental engineered solutions within the built environment and infrastructure development. She has worked on multiple high-profile projects within the region, driving sustainable solutions from strategic evaluation, project inception, design, construction, commissioning, and handover, all the way through to operations. Hala is currently spearheading the race to net zero with several clients to achieve ambitious, uncharted targets. I'll now hand over to our moderator for the webinar, Dave. Over to you, Dave.
Thank you very much, Wendy. That's very kind of you. And thank you to yourself and your colleagues at the Centre of Excellence in Smart Construction for the invitation to moderate this webinar. And it's on a very topical issue. We've heard already that it's a race to net zero and that there's plenty to do. And within the construction sector, of course, it's a very significant source of global warming emissions, greenhouse gases. And depending on where you are in the world, this can vary, but up to 50% of some countries' emissions are from buildings. And of course, there's many emissions associated with the construction supply chain. So it's key that we do address the emissions within this sector. And we have to do it quickly. It is a race, and we do have to make significant reductions in those emissions at a pace that's probably unprecedented within the construction industry, and actually within all of our lifetimes. We do have to really up the ante and make some changes here. So how do we go about doing that? Well, carbon accounting is one of those methods. It's key. We can't really address emissions if we don't understand them properly and the various different sources of those emissions. So on today's webinar, we're going to look at how we can develop a deeper understanding of carbon accounting within construction products and looking at supply chains and projects as well, and in particular on the skills and capacity building that is needed in order to do that. And initially this webinar, we're going to have a presentation from Ivano, and he's going to set the scene, and then we're going to have a panel discussion, and there is plenty of opportunity to take your questions. We very much invite your questions. I can see we've got many attendees to this webinar, so I hope that you will be posting your questions in the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screen there. So without further ado, let me hand over to Ivano for his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Wendy, you forgot my most important credential. I am a student, a Harriet Watt as well. I'm a recent doctorate candidate, and hopefully be able to contribute to meaningful knowledge going forward. But having said that, I do have to say that being part of this Center of Excellence is an eye-opening experience, because there is so much efficiency to be driven from every little corner. And again, construction is a big topic. It's not my primary focus, or has not been my primary focus in the past, but going forward, I can see a lot of value. But as we said, I did like Dave's introduction, the race to net zero. And this is specifically an element of a piece of legislation, an international agreement that was signed in 2015, and that we all know as the Paris Agreement. Essentially, this agreement came into force January 1st, 2021, in the midst of the pandemic, unfortunately, but did put pressure on countries and governments to implement what they had agreed upon. Now, this has had a cascading effect on all the countries, trickling down to the private sector as well. So this has started affecting policy, affecting performance, but affecting also everyday life. And you will see just how this cascades. So let me start by saying that this is not the only piece of legislation which is relevant. One big, let's say, news is the establishment of the first carbon border adjustment mechanism that has had an additional effect on the Paris Agreement acceptance and implementation. Essentially, the European Union, as part of their Fit for 55 legislative package, included a carbon border adjustment protocol that requires imports in specific categories to pay for their emissions the same way the European Union entities would have to comply to the ETS. Although the mechanism was intentionally meant to avoid high emitters to choose a different country or geography to continue their processes, this is having quite an interesting effect from 2 points of view. First and foremost, every company in the sectors implemented has strengthened their carbon accounting mechanism and looking at ways to reduce vis-a-vis paying for the emission reductions. The segments covered by the CBAM are steel and aluminum, cement, fertilizers, and energy, but might be expanded to additional areas as well. And what is relevant to say is that in the EU, buildings have just been included under the ETS. So where is this race to net zero? Well, let's put it this way. We have a carbon budget, which has been established looking at 100 years ability of our globe to metabolize CO2 emissions. And we've been quite irresponsible in the sense that you have to think of a carbon budget just like any other budget. So we've spent the vast majority of this budget already. So if you consider the overall budget for 100 years to be in the range of 1.5 gigatons, we've been emitting an average of 40 to 50 billion per year since the turn of the millennia. We're now in year 2022. So if you do the math, we've already consumed the vast majority of this budget. So we need to proverbially tighten the belt to be able to last long enough to avoid emergency situations. And this is why you see this race to net zero. So targets, governments will set priority areas which will cascade down to everyday life. Some of it will be in the form of mitigation, but most of it will come also from adaptation. The immediate effects are quite visible. We have several segments, and this is just a very small sample of it, that have started to declare the net zero ambition. Now, they have to do it in certain cases to comply with legislative environments, but in other cases, it's just to meet their end users' expectations. So we have automotive, construction, and even packaging being at the forefront of this. Automotive having a very large demand for, in our case, like low carbon metal, whether this is steel or aluminum, because their vehicles sold must meet specific requirements. But this has cascaded down all to other sectors as well. So this is essentially a snapshot of what the of a few areas which have to meet consumer demand, but this is being applied consistently over a number of other industries as we go towards 2030 and then towards the race to 2050. Well, we do have a 2050 net zero strategic initiative, which was launched last year in October, just ahead of COP26 in Glasgow. And the initiative comprises of different activities in 4 sectors. Even if the sector is broad, individual programs and activities, we will be monitored on a year-to-year basis and aligned to the UAE principles for the next 50s. How are these monitored? Well, the same way that they will be monitored in smart construction, they will be monitored everywhere else. We use a very simple model, which is an ISO model, which divides emissions into 3 scopes. And you will hear scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 numerous ways. So scope 1 emissions are direct emissions. Essentially, these are the companies that actually burn fossil fuel to either generate power, very specific processes that do require emissions. The vast majority of businesses, on the other end, will look at scope 2 emissions as their major culprit. And this is the electricity you buy predominantly, but also steam, heat, cooling. So district cooling would fall into this category as an example, whereas district heating would, in other countries, would follow suit. And the last one, scope 3, is all your upstream and downstream emissions from either your supply chain or the cost of delivering your activities. Now, in recent years, this has been expanded to 15 specific categories, which address the different areas of indirect emissions within the scope 3. And as we go along, companies will be asked to offset more and more of their scope 3 emissions or create these net zero clubs where they would essentially work within each other's value chain to avoid scope 3 emissions. The protocol is fairly simple. Everything is mapped out as per ISO 14060 family. There are different products, different activities, and this is where I really start the skills requirement. In my personal experience, and again, I've gathered greenhouse gas inventories in the Middle East for the last 15 years. The first skill set which is required is the understanding of this ISO standard, which cascades down into the different scopes and position. But there is another element of it, which is currently coming really close to it, which is the digitalization of data streams. So imagine ISO 14060 family being the methodology and digital being the tool going forward. So what is it that construction or any other industries facing in reporting their CO2 emissions. There is a very simple path to do this, and it's a four-step approach. Essentially, you start by calculating your business as usual approach, which is based on your historical data. 3 years is the minimum, 5 years preferable, and you get the projection going forward, or let's call it the no action scenario. Based on this business as usual, you will start listing all those activities which have an environmental impact on your CO2 emissions business as usual scenario. Some of them, as you can see in this slide on the far left, are actually generating a profit. So they are quick and simple, and this could be quite easily your energy efficiency activities, your water activities, your water efficiency activities, whereas other require substantial investment, which takes longer to recuperate. When you create an emission reduction cost curve, you basically map them all out vis-a-vis the investment and the return, and you're able to qualify them over a period of time. The next step would be to create a climate risk matrix. And again, so far, we're really not talking of much difference from the current approach, because you do have people that account for your emissions. You do have people that account for your risk management. And all you need is just a little bit of innovation going forward, looking at ways where you can create your low carbon pathway. The purpose of all this is to create what is commonly known as an MRV. Now, as the name suggests, MRV is monitoring, reporting, and verification, which is a process which runs annually within both governments and businesses, where you just revise your numbers vis-a-vis your pathway. But there is also a different set of targets that we need to look at from a corporate standpoint. Targets the science-based targets. There are, or part of the science-based initiative is required to revise levels. But again, this is a disclosure platform. So by participating in this activity, you're not required to target 1.5. You can very well set your own target, but nevertheless, over time, you're expected to improve on this. Now, the relevance of SBTi is that no offsets can be used. This means that you cannot just transfer your environmental liability to someone else. Net zero is essentially the same as a science-based target, but allows you to utilize nature-based removals and carbon capture and utilization, or carbon capture and storage, to offset your existentials CO2 emissions. And those are the CO2 emissions that under the current technology cannot be avoided in any way. Carbon neutral is a lot more generous, allows you to use different types of credits and tools to offset your emissions and issue a certification of such. And carbon negative is the ultimate goal, where not only you do your complete avoidance, but you're actually generating a negative CO2 footprint. The same with carbon free, but carbon free actually targets a no offset usage at all. Now, they're all equally relevant. And again, there is a lot of debate within the offset, non-offset community, but the way we see it from the eye level is that there isn't a right or wrong at this time, as long as from an economic standpoint, we invest in technologies that do have a positive impact. So what are, oh, 1 second. So what are the industry pillars that will be affected? Yet again, this is a non-exhaustive list, but just if you think from a construction standpoint, and I wanted to use this slide to then allow the panel to elaborate further on both the tools and the skills required. In construction, we have a very conservative society, so to say. One of the first things that we have to look at is energy. At the moment, energy is looked as a connection to a grid. Energy is no longer that. Energy has become decentralized. Whether this is power for the building or thermal energy requirements, this is often looked upon within the building itself, rather than a simple connection to the grid. Then there is a lot more coming from the professional realm. So the agreements, whether these are power purchase agreements for renewables or simple evaluations and compliances for labeling, whether these are leads as we know them today or future carbon labels going ahead. From an engineering standpoint, we also have a lot more digitalization within the prospect itself. So we need to make sure that the engineering around construction embeds all the sensor requirements, all the future necessities that might be foreseen at this point in time. And again, 10 years ago, this could have been simple ducting for wiring. Now, with all the complexities and protocols of communication, it might be slightly more exhaustive than that. From the construction side, we also need to make sure that we are able to train the blue-collar workforce to understand the difference and the requirements within this transfer and digitalization of the activities. But not only that, understand the preciousness of resources and the requirements to make sure that we try to save as much as possible. And also from a craft point of view, we need to make sure that there is an upskilling of the current categories. One last item that I could think of was the EVs. Today, many buildings do not have infrastructure to charge electric vehicles. We're seeing a quick electrification of transport. So these must be looked at not only from just charging the cars, but also how we can avail of efficiencies from all these power banks located in the basements when they're not needed. Having said this, Dave, back to you to get the panel started.
Thank you very much for that very informative presentation of Anno, and it really has helped to set the scene beautifully. So actually, I'm just going to come back to you and ask you a couple of linked questions just to get the panel started. So it's apparent from the first few slides that you presented that the extent of the change required is actually quite enormous. It's a new mindset altogether. And whilst we're seeing some excellent work, and we're going to hear about some excellent work today in order to reduce these emissions, do you think that there's a kind of common level of climate literacy that needs to be provided to all stakeholders? And also, who do you think these key stakeholders are? You mentioned kind of regulators, and then there's construction industry professionals, but is there a broader set of stakeholders that we need to engage just to get that basic level of climate literacy at a point where people can have a better dialogue?
Climate literacy, it's a beautiful term. And I would suggest for the industry associations to take this lead. And again, you're familiar with ASI being an auditor for the Aluminum Stewardship Initiative. These are the kind of bodies that set the scene. Even because at the end of the day, in the short term, there isn't any silver bullet that will solve the climate change issue at once. There is more like a basket of measures which tells you when you can implement a certain technology and when the shift is economically viable. Now, some entities might adopt it earlier to gain market share. Other entities might be more passive and wait until the cost of technology decreases. However, the window between early and late adopters does not really amount to much. So early adoption actually provides the best economic value vis-a-vis waiting for the legislation to impose it.
Thank you. So a common level of climate literacy is needed, so that also has to cover across a broad range of stakeholders. And we had a question raised in the Q&A about these concepts being applied within GCC countries. Are they being applied within regulations yet, or being promoted so far? And perhaps I could invite Hala to answer that one.
So there has been the pledge recently in the region for the net zero on a national level. However, that hasn't translated to regulations for when we talk about codes and standards to dictate for individual private developments or even government developments as such. So like Ivana said, it's the leaders that will have the best let's say, economies of scale of doing things early on and adopting it. At the moment, we don't have anything regulated as such, but we know the roadmap is coming and we know the regulations are coming now that we have a national pledge. And it's only a matter of time when that does happen.
David,
Thank you. And
if
are we
we
seeing...
add on Ala's as well, I'll just quickly, the UAE has always been known for a carrot approach rather than a stick. So if we look at it from an economic perspective, there are clear economic advantages towards compliance. So if I know that I'm liable to pay for a CBAM fee to enter Europe, would I rather cut a check or invest these funds in my own asset?
And can I just extend that question beyond the UAE as well to the GCC region? Are we seeing this in other countries as well, where there's efforts to raise kind of climate literacy and talk about carbon accounting? And you mentioned public procurement, which I think is an interesting area as well. And perhaps, Ferenc, perhaps you're able to add some information on this as well.
Yes, thank you. Absolutely. I think right now I'm based in Saudi Arabia, and I would highlight, for example, the Mostadam building certification scheme, which was with the cooperation with my company Alpin developed. And this is seen both public and private developments as a, let's say, a local language for green building certification, so absolutely related to literacy. But also let me help with a couple of slides. If this will work, I would just highlight a couple of data about the region and the construction industry. If this is visible now. Excellent. So I thought it's just good. The United Arab Emirates was quoted. So just to have a look of the scale of the market there in terms of construction contracts. And I think it's very visible that the highest carbon saving is those building which was not built, right? And the market really decreased in 19 and 2020, which is obviously not a very good news for the industry itself, but in terms of how to rebound and how to start the projects again, it is a very good opportunity to jump in and introducing let's say, more sustainable approaches. I also looked at the attendance, and I have realized how many audience is from Egypt, which is also an impressive growth expectation in the region, even compared to Saudi Arabia or the UAE. So Egypt is experiencing a huge growth rate. And one might wonder how come that with so high ambitions, Saudi Arabia is still in negative. This is another slide about the construction backlog, which means that how many percent of the contracts already awarded, but not yet actually built. And here, Saudi is really high, like almost 1/3 of the constructed projects are not built yet. Whereas, for example, in Egypt or Oman, Qatar, those are the countries where this backlog is very limited. But also for me, this table or this chart shows that at which stage of the project sustainability and carbon considerations can be most effectively implemented before those are contracted. So here, I would say in those countries where this backlog is lower, here we have a more active contribution, whereas high level of contracts issued, those projects are already in the pipeline. And one last data I have seen from Ivano's presentations industry, renewable projects, I think still region, what are the sectors where the new constructions are taking place? And overwhelmingly, the gas industry is one sector, but construction, let's say buildings, residential projects are coming to the second. But for those, and here we are talking about students and the future carbon expertise. So there is a significant share of power, so actual renewable projects. But I would also highlight water, so all projects related to desalination and water infrastructure is just as significant. So I thought these are, let's say, the elements of the market. If somebody is asking, so how can I get involved into low carbon constructions? Here are, let's say, the hot regions and the sectors where, let's say, future experts can get involved.
Thank you, Ferenc. And I want to pick up on a couple of those points. And that's good to see the kind of the status of the different industries. A question has come in around, do we have reliable and accurate data in the region, and in particular in the construction industry, or to drive carbon accounting effectively? And I'm going to ask a secondary question to that in a moment. But Fernando, I don't know whether this is your area here, whether you would be able to contribute to that in terms of your understanding of the information that you see within the construction value chain, and then we can broaden this out.
Yeah, thank you, Dave. So perhaps not specifically in the GCC area, but definitely in the construction industry. And it's very important to understand every aspect of the entire value chain to understand where all the emissions are coming from. It's really important to have the contribution of each let's say stakeholder from the planning and design phase all the way to the construction and handover of projects. Because sometimes companies and people just think of the production process as where the emissions are coming from, but actually we really need to think of the whole process. And this is something we are doing at our company, but sometimes it's a bit challenging to also bring or perhaps convince some of the larger companies to provide this kind of data. I don't know if you want to like build on top of that.
Yeah, thank you. And so I think it's a very critical point for everybody to understand, is that we can be running around trying to put carbon values on everything, but perhaps our attention should be focused on some of the key areas. And you also mentioned the stages of any particular project and the importance of getting it in early. So Hala, can I just invite you to perhaps expand on that? Should delegates be thinking about focusing on particular materials, construction materials, or particular parts of a construction project? And also, when should they be thinking about that?
Yeah, I mean, I like the way you phrased it. It's like certain materials. And yes, I mean, in the GCC, this part of the world, we're traditionally not very innovative with the way we design and build. If we look around, we see, most of the buildings are similar in terms of the core materials that we use for the structure and the facade. So we're very heavily reliant on steel concrete in this part of the world and glazing. So you've got your, over your 50% of your emitters in your embodied carbon just with those materials alone. And a lot of times when we do talk to people, it's saying, okay, let's focus on those that will give you the quickest returns. And they're usually just a handful of materials for your from your supply chain. So really you're engaging with, okay, I understand that you're to drive that information from all the suppliers might be a huge task to do from the beginning, but to focus on a few suppliers and then for that to trickle down. And I do think that we do need to put that emphasis on. I think it is really important to mandate it, because like every other country, every other region around the world, before it was mandatory, there was barely any carbon information associated with materials or utilities, etc. But once that becomes the norm and the market does mature in that respect, and I think we're getting there quite quickly, it will become something that's more available. So without a doubt.
Great. And certainly from my experiences, steel at about 8% of global CO2, concrete, well, cement, another 8%, the two biggest sectors. And then, as you mentioned, within the materials, potentially 50%, embodied wood just for these two. So there's a great kind of thought and starting point. And I think that if the pressure comes from the construction firms, then we have this opportunity to really ask these suppliers for this information.
And I think we've got,
yes,
sorry,
please.
just to add to that, I think we've got mega developers in the region. I think in a much bigger scale than we do in other parts of the world. I saw that Aldar is one of your sponsors for the center. They are a mega developer who has the driving capacity to change supply chain, to dictate from an early stage to say, and this is something they are doing and quite well at, and saying, right, we have this ambitious target, you need to get on board. And a lot of suppliers will listen because of the scale that they're at.
Thank you. And so, Ivano, do you believe that this should become well, we talked about mandating this and a regulation. Are there other opportunities? And, earlier on, we kind of touched on public procurement when there are these public projects. Should they be leading the way?
I have to say, I've always been a strong advocate of the proverbial carrot approach. And when we look at carbon accounting today, no, the private sector does not have the ability in place. First and foremost, there are different tools. You guys touched upon a few of them: carbon accounting, life cycle assessment, ISO 14064. Each one of these is used for a different purpose. Now, when we do carbon accounting, emission reduction, this is predominantly a political framework. It's not an actual accounting of CO2 emissions. is an accounting of resources. So starting from that point, is there a single manager that does not wish to reduce the resources and still retain quality delivery? Obviously, yes. This could be staff time, this could be amount of cement and steel, this could be anything whatsoever. At the moment, there is absolutely no need for a company to do that other than the intelligence looking forward and competing with other marketplaces. So essentially doing exactly the same you do today with much less resources going forward. Having said this, what we strongly suggest from the day I was with the UN, and even now when I advise friends and colleagues, is to embed a shadow carbon pricing within the organization. So imagine if tomorrow you were to sell your products in Europe and implement this internally. Now, it does not cost you anything. All it does, it has a cascading effect in your value chain. So it looks at your carbon emission, your procurement department is the first affected because they would have to evaluate and assess and compare CO2 emissions of the materials and suppliers. And in doing so, they will also evaluate which supplier is stronger and which one is weaker. Now, I'm not saying you have to choose on the base of the lowest carbon emitter, but already having the shadow carbon price will have a cascading effect on your suppliers as well, who will have to start doing their carbon accounting and reporting. All of a sudden, people will be like, why is this cement so much carbon intensive than the other one? Oh, what if they find out that I'm buying cement which is made from coal rather than a more renewable energy source? Now, at the moment, we're looking at cement and there is very few pathways, but in the future, we'll also look at cement as a way to store CO2 emission through the process of mineralization. Now, this is what will happen probably 5-10 years down the line. But starting somewhere is just putting accounting in your procurement.
And okay, so putting accounting in your procurement. And Ferenc as well, if is it kind of sometimes being asked for too late? And we talked about the stages of the value chain. You know, do we need to be focusing more on the architects, the designers, the specifiers, and getting it up front in those conversations, even when we're talking about kind of master planning stages and really early? What's your thoughts on that?
Yes, absolutely. I think it is very critical to have from the developer side a vision that they want to have a certain certification standard. And I would say at least on the public investments that I see in the KSA it's there. So developers and projects want to be ambitious and want to have international standards reached. And on the master planning level, this is part of the design program. And most of the projects are at present this stage. When the certain elements of the master plan will be implemented and public and private investments will come, how this will be realized, it is still a challenge. But I would say that the walk that we walked in Europe, and it took 10 or 15 years, I see absolutely a faster process here in the Gulf region, and this might take time, but will be much faster.
Thank you, Ferenc. And there was a question come through the chat around just clarifying what we mean by a construction company, and so and pointing out that, you know, it's the design engineers, the architects who are best placed to be able to determine some of these specifications and requirements, and then the developer often then kind of applies that, and it depends on their level of integration. So thank you to Bruce Paul for just clarifying that. And I just wanted to look at innovation as well, because we have Fernando, who has got fantastic experience with this. Do we have the skill sets and enough of an open mind to enable the use and consideration of innovative technologies so that they offer and provide another opportunity to kind of tackle some of the key carbon areas, and also through digitization that was referred to earlier to kind of capture that carbon data?
Yes, so regarding the skill set, this is something that has to be built or developed throughout time. I would say it's in a raw version right now, but it has to be something that Ivano was saying of us having to retrain the blue collar workers and basically reassign these skills that they have in order to have this new focus into more sustainable processes, more sustainable technologies, and more sustainable materials. If we think, again, going back to the value chain, I wanted to give an example of something that has happened near us in Finland. Well, this happened in Sweden, where one of the largest cement factories called Cementa didn't get the renewal of their permit to operate, and they are in charge of 70% of the production of the country. So it's quite a lot. What perhaps is a challenge is that you have some push from the regulator to eliminate this very high emitting process, but there's no regulation to allow new processes and materials and technologies to replace this big lack. There's going to be 70% of it's going to become a problem, right? So what would happen then is that they need to ship perhaps cement from Finland or from other countries. And I think this is a gap that has to be filled from the regulators, but also in collaboration with the different stakeholders, such as the developers, the builders, the designers as well. So it has to be a constant development to be able to reach that skill set need.
And with things like some of the robotic construction methods, does that provide us with an opportunity to both better understand and control kind of carbon numbers, if you like, that are associated with the build, but also to reduce it?
Definitely, because when we use robotics, when we use automation tools, we are digitalizing the entire process. So we have access to more data along the different parts of the construction process. So this makes it easier to measure how much emissions are being emitted, right? How many CO2 emissions are produced throughout the process. And this makes it easier for perhaps the contractor, the designers and engineers from the beginning to be able to plan for future projects and reduce the emissions. And it's very important to think from the beginning of these projects, because we can think of reduction of materials when using new technologies such as robotics and 3D printing, but also implementation of more sustainable materials. For example, using less cement. So yeah.
And Ivano, I saw you nodding there. Would you like to add to this dynamic? You mentioned digitization in your introduction as one of the key things. So please, would you expand on that?
There are two elements of it that really make sense within the context of reduction of CO2 emissions and accounting, but also looking at skills going forward. One is the fact that with the digitalization and Industry 4.0, what we're actually able to do is aggregate little efficiencies, which would otherwise be neglected, into large numbers. This is specifically in the industrial sector a major win. But the other element of it is the fact that through digitalization, through the new tools that we have today, we are able to improve the efficiency, reduce the tolerances to complete the same tasks that we do today. Now, obviously, this is linked a lot to legislation, because certain changes have to come from the municipalities before cascade down to the construction industry. But nevertheless, going forward, even looking at 3D printed houses, these will allow us to use a lot less resources to generate the same output.
Thank you. And I appreciate that our time is getting low, but I think that we're able to continue for a few more minutes. And I just wanted to pick up on a very good question, which is, the question is, does net zero drive focus on existing buildings as well? And can you please list a few things that would be focused on in retrofit? And this is dear to my heart from the UK, where we've got, a very large stock of very old housing stock that is terribly energy inefficient. And it basically 85% of the buildings that are going to be here in 2050 have already been built for us. And I know within the GCC, this is a different picture, but still we need to be able to retrofit and look back. Hala, and then I'll come on to Frank briefly. Could you just give us some insight in what can we do with existing buildings and carbon accounting, please?
Yeah, I mean, with existing buildings, this has been the elephant in the room in the industry for quite some time. And I think in the UK recently, Neighbours, which was in Australia and Southeast Asia, has now come into effect in the UK because it's seen the drive for the need for operating buildings to now being, I wouldn't just say retrofitted. Sometimes it's operational tweaks that would have the significant impact on their actual performance. But again, it's taking that shift to existing buildings. And I think in the region, there's been a big focus on sustainability in terms of new builds and not really on existing, just because the old was seen to be, okay, will be torn down, etc. But like you said, the bulk of them are already here, whatever we've built in the past 10 years. But there has been a big lack of continuity in terms of how are they actually operating once they're handed over, even if they have the gold, platinum certifications. I think this will come into place as the net zero drive does come in. I don't see it that much yet, or as the need that it deserves to be put on emphasis. I've worked in operations for quite a fair bit of time, and 50% of your water savings will come purely from leakage detection. And that is a very sad reality, whether it's underground pipes leaking or whether it's taps, etc., sanitary ware leaking. And it's such an easy one. And in terms of energy, again, it's just the optimization. And these are things you don't capture in design. And this is where there is the disconnect between design and actual operation. And this is where you have oversizing of your substations, etc. And I'm not using the word net zero because I think no matter what we design at the moment, it's not going to be net zero. The technology does not exist yet. The grid does not exist. It's not green enough to be there as it stands at the moment on a mass scale, if we really want to be realistic about it. But I do think the emphasis will be put on, like it's happening around the world. And I think oil and gas prices will help that story as well. It always cycles. I mean, this is where the birth of sustainability started from in the 70s, with oil prices increasing exponentially, etc. We do know the climate emergency at the moment, but again, it always helps to have another factor that will push it.
Thank you, Hala. And Frank, please.
Yeah, absolutely. Just linking to Hala's comments. Actually, today, meeting with a client, the first time I've heard the expression that increasing energy prices is a concern in Saudi, and this is a concern. And I also believe that the consumption of the cars will be a concern very soon. So this is again something going to happen much sooner than we expected. And if I can also chip into the digitization and technology part, which was discussed earlier, just a very interesting research was published sometime last year around still the COVID times about the Middle East, and the questionnaire, what are the barriers for companies adopting robotics and new technologies in the construction sector. MEED was doing this research, and I find very interesting that two issues were mentioned more than 50% of the respondents. One was that lack of awareness, and the second was lack of top-driven approach. So if a construction company or an architect firm, top management is not engaged into 3D printing, then it will be very difficult to implement. Whereas only less than 20% of the respondents called cost as a main barrier. So here, I think webinars and more awareness raising around these technologies is crucial, both for those providing these technologies and both for those willing to find new jobs in that sector.
Thank you. That's great. And now we discussed a broad range of topics, and I would just like to summarize some and then invite Wendy back in to give his opinion on some of them. And in particular, there was a question as well that came up in the Q&A around, can you recommend a certification system to learn about and get accredited in carbon accounting? And I would like to broaden that question out, Wendy, and just kind of leave that one with you for a moment about, can you recommend anything in terms of what people can practically do to raise their awareness in carbon accounting? But just to summarize some of the things that we've discussed today, we've kind of broadened this right out. We've looked at who we need to engage with and whether we should focus on key materials. We talked about, in particular, about steel and concrete, and the way in particular on larger developments, mega developers and the specifiers and the tenderers, at those getting in at an early stage is very, very important. Some discussion around mandating these, but we also don't want to forget some of the other opportunities we have with broader emissions reductions. And we talked about the way that digitizing this can help to kind of aggregate and collate smaller opportunities that can actually lead to those bigger savings, but always being aware of what the carbon price is. So introducing shadow carbon accounting in relation to everything that you're doing in a construction project, so that you're not only looking at the price of it, but what's the carbon implication of that. And I think that's key. We looked at some of the innovative technologies with 3D printing of materials and how digitizing the whole process can enable some of those gains and also more efficient construction processes. We want this vision from the clients, essentially, to ask for this, ask for the carbon numbers, build it into public procurement, build it into private sector procurement, specify it, tender it. And then we looked at the end there around what we do with the existing buildings, and we can do operational tweaks, but also this kind of idea of potentially retrofitting, and we need the skill sets to be able to do that. And I do note on the development, the slides that Frank kindly showed, that most money is still going into kind of gas, as we would expect, but that raises this kind of challenge. Okay, so we're creating more emissions with the work that we're doing, and how quickly do we need to change the mindsets and the skill sets of the next generation of people coming through? And for me as well, this is about collaboration. And less competition, more collaboration through the value chain. So Wendy, can I invite you back in, please, just to comment on some of those issues and how Heriot Watt and the work that you're doing there at the Centre of Excellence in Smart Construction can really help move people along in this space?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. And I also want to thank all our panelists for the contributions that they've made. I think there's a lot that is actually happening in industry in terms of carbon accounting and trying to plug in the skills gap. I think one of the things that is key, and as a center that we try to do, is try to link the kind of things that are happening in industry with what's happening in research and academia. And that's where the center actually comes in terms of what we're trying to do, in terms of bringing out the research that we're undertaking in universities. And it's not just here at Watt universities, we link up with other universities as well. So Dave, just as you were saying that there shouldn't really be competition amongst industry players, as an organization, as a center, we try to link up within our university, within our global operations, but also link up with other universities where we can see the expertise. So, I certainly see this as the beginning of that discussion and looking at where we can take this forward for the next 5, 10 years moving forward. But I think the key thing is, that continuous collaboration between industry, between government organizations and research organizations and academia. It's been a really interesting discussion, and I think there's certain opportunities for collaboration. I'm just going to wind this up by alerting the audience to our next webinar, which will be titled A Whole Life Cycle Approach to Value Creation in Construction. There'll be more details about this webinar coming up in due course. So watch this space, and that's all I'll say. So that concludes today's program. I just want to thank our panelists and the audience for your participation. You may now disconnect. Thank you, and goodbye, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank
Goodbye.
you.
Okay.